Hello, everyone. Welcome to AI Safety Salon. We have guests who speak about their experiences with their work with AI. We have people who have been thinking about it, working with it from many different angles on the show. Today, we have Scot Rousse. Uh, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. And hi, Andrew and Alton. I always enjoy and get a lot out of being in conversation with you two. So I was delighted to have this invitation. And what brings me to the AI conversation is it's a long, twisted path that starts with most recently probably me getting a PhD in philosophy. Um, in my dissertation work in philosophy, I wrote about the German philosopher Martin Heidegger, who wrote a big, fascinating book, troubling, interesting, fascinating book called Being and Time, Sein und Zeit, that came out in 1927. But my thesis advisor, or one of my PhD advisors, was a philosopher named Hubert Dreyfus, who was not only the foremost Heidegger scholar in the English-speaking world, but was also one of the earliest, or perhaps wrote the first philosophical critique of artificial intelligence, a research report for the Rand Corporation in 1965 called Alchemy and Artificial Intelligence. So through Bert, as his friends call him, that I became interested in the AI conversation. Um, but it was still a few stepping stones from there to here because I completed my PhD in, 2000, late 2011. And as I was about to go on what philosophers amusingly call the job market, to go try to be a philosophy professor, this was still the university system was reeling from the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. All funding had dried up, particularly for Heidegger scholars, it seemed. And well, right around that time, Hubert Dreyfus introduced me to a fascinating character named Fernando Flores, who was running a sort of think tank about innovation for the Chilean government at the time period. He was supposed to produce a report on innovation. The council, it was called the Council for Productivity and Innovation and Competitiveness. And Fernando's a character such that he thought it would be useful to have a Heidegger scholar on his research team for producing his innovation reports. That's because Fernando, I'll tell you more about him later because he's a big part of my story and my whole approach to AI and my approach to life and philosophy. Fernando uh, was a PhD in philosophy also from Berkeley through Hubert Dreyfus and his brother Stuart Dreyfus and a philosopher of language named John Searle. Fernando ended up, prior to that, he was in politics in the Chilean government and was eventually a senator in the early 2000s. And so when he was tapped to write the innovation report, he knew he had to bring some philosophical angle. So he was looking for philosophical interlocutors, someone who had a similar training as him, like me, to work on the innovation report. So through working with Fernando on that report, I ended up, then he came back to California, and I've been working with him ever since in his company called Pluralistic Networks. We're like a consulting and professional development company that harnesses work, research, and philosophy and a bunch of other areas for creating conversational tools and emotional skills and sensibilities for taking care of ourselves and each other in this crazy world. And that's
Very
still the
cool.
position I'm in now. It's 2024. I've been working with Fernando in that company for about 10 years.
Okay, that is an amazing CV, honestly. There are some really interesting names in that list, and people like Dreyfus really were, well, specifically Dreyfus, not people like him, were really foundational in bringing some of the initial criticism of what AI was capable of. Those conversations are still incredibly relevant. And you recently co-authored an article called "Can Machines Be in Language?" Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, yes, happily. And I'm very proud of this piece. It's kind of a polemical piece. And so there's not an argumentative structure for all the details of the claims we make in there. It's meant to provoke conversation and reflection about what AI is capable of, specifically the large language models that have shown up to be so powerful and fascinating and troubling in this time period. And my co-author is a computer science professor at the Naval Postgraduate School named Peter Denning. And Peter and I had been in a lot of conversations around LLMs over the past year, and we're starting to explore that. Really, our question is, our realization was that um, a lot of the big claims going around about LLMs having these models discovered something deep about language. It's clear that they did, but the biggest claims were making much stronger arguments that they can be in conversation now, just like human beings can. And it seemed to us a very reductive understanding of what human language is, almost reducing human language to statistical models of recurrences of certain tokens. And of course, the LLMs are predicting the words that normally would come next in a given sentence, and are in a certain sense trying to produce something that satisfies our native speaker's expectations of how a conversation would flow. But still, to us, it seemed to be very reductive to say that this that language is essentially a statistical model of word streams. And so we wanted to say that this raises the question again. It puts into the question, what is distinctive about human language? It puts that right back on the agenda of technical reflection, philosophical reflection, everyday conversation. What do we mean when we say that human beings speak language, or as we put it somewhat weirdly in our title, are in language?
Hmm.
Because our argument here is that language is not just a tool. It's not just a tool to transmit information from one um, data processor to another. A lot of people around here in Silicon Valley like to think of us human beings as really we're just data processors too. We have hardware, it's called the brain. We have software, it's called the mind. And communication consists in my hardware running a program called my mind and getting information from my mind into your mind. And it gets transmitted by these acoustic blasts that we call words. And so we're arguing that language is connected with these more fundamental human issues. And more precisely, I want to say language is connected to how we care.
Hmm.
The decisive feature about human beings is that we care. We care about things in the world. We care about how our life goes. We care about how other people treat us and how we treat other people. And in connection with that, our capacity to care for things to matter to us is connected to our capacities for experiencing certain emotions and moods. And that emotions and moods are not just kind of psychic states that flare up in our nervous system. They're connected to our linguistic capacities. Language for us isn't just a free-floating capacity separate from our engagement in the world, separate from our emotional and mood reactions, separate from the fact that things matter to us. Our linguistic capacities are intimately intertwined with how things matter to us, with the emotions and moods that we get into, um, given that things matter to us and that we can articulate them in language. And moreover, one final thing I'll say in this first blast is language is a way that we coordinate commitments. Now, this is a fundamental shift in a view of language that in philosophy originates with the speech act theory from an Oxford philosopher named John Austin, who has a fascinating series of lectures called How to Do Things with Words. And that this approach to language was formalized by a philosophy professor at UC Berkeley named John Searle, who has a book called Speech Acts and then has a super important paper called A Taxonomy of Illocutionary Acts. And where their argument there is that previous philosophers had been obsessed with the question of meaning and truth. They understood meaning in terms of the truth conditions of a sentence. You could understand what a sentence meant if you understood the conditions under which it was true. And so the philosophical analysis of language was really stuck in all of this interest in truth conditions and propositions. And these guys were saying, no, we're not just going around formulating propositions that might be true or false about the world. We're making requests. We're inviting people to parties. We're christening ships by smashing a champagne bottle on them. We're pronouncing people man and wife. We're placing people under arrest. And all of these things happen in language. We do things with our language. We're coordinating our activities in language. And when it comes down to it, we're coordinating commitments. And this is the move that Fernando Flores, my boss and my colleague and my writing partner, makes made very strongly. Actually, in his work, he wrote a book called Understanding Computers and Cognition that came out in 1986, co-authored with Terry Winograd, a computer science professor at Stanford. And I'm going to come back to this later because it's still an important part of my approach to this whole thing. But they make a big deal out of the fact that language is a coordination of commitments. When you invited me to be on the show, yes, it was a string of words, but it was also a modulation in our relationship with each other. It set up normative expectations. You expected me to be here or expected me to renegotiate my commitment, which I did once already. And so we formed an expectation. When I accepted your invitation, that became a promise that I would be here. And it became a commitment between us two. And the amazing thing about human beings is that we are the animal that can make promises and that can set a stake in the future from the present and organize our activity so that we satisfy that promise. We can navigate our present moment into an imagined future. Nietzsche was the philosopher who said, "Isn't it weird that human beings are the only animal who can make promises?" And he has a long, troubling story about all that it takes for us to have turned ourselves into the kind of creatures who can make and keep promises. But in any case, language we create commitments with each other. Our social fabric with each other is generated in our linguistic activity and our talking, and it matters to us how we keep these commitments or not. And our whole social worlds and organizations like companies can be analyzed as networks of commitment undertaken in language. That was the thesis also of my friend and colleague and boss Fernando. All right. I think I've gone on a rant that I can now stop and give you a chance to reply.
Okay, I am gathering my thoughts because there was a lot of content in what you said. But what comes to mind immediately is the Turing test.
Mhm, mhm.
So when we're speaking about, well, Turing is the person who originally formulated the Turing test as a thought experiment, not as an actual experiment, not
Right,
as an
right.
experimental design, but as a thought experiment about how we would determine whether a machine is capable of what a human is capable of. And that's a subset of the um, evaluation by behavior. Now, when you're talking about speech act theory and more specifically Fernando's theory of coordinating commitments,
Mhm.
how does that fit into behavioral models of intelligence, and how would we know if a machine is capable of speech acts or of coordinating commitments?
Yeah, I'm gonna try my best to answer that question from the perspective of the traditions I represent, but then I'm also going to dodge the question entirely.
Okay.
Um,
What I'm going to ask for, though, is that
okay.
when you dodge the question entirely, that may be, are you doing so as like on a meta level, questioning the question?
Yes,
And if so, explain a little bit about that rationale.
I will happily.
Thank you.
Um, because in a certain extent, I do think that the more interesting questions are for us, people alive now, grappling with the rise of LLMs and a new wave of generative AI. The questions that are gripping for us now are more questions that are how do we interact with these entities, with these machines, with these models, and what does it mean for us to be able to use them and not be used by them? And I think that now goes under the heading of the question of AI alignment, which I had learned that I care a lot about from talking with you. um, but from the perspective of the traditions that I'm coming from, the what matters is um, the capacity for being an interactive partner in a conversation. And that means minimally that you're not just processing sequences of words, but that you have the capacity to make and follow through on commitments, that you have the capacity to take responsibility for that, because you will also be held responsible for those by those among whom you are coordinating and making promises and requests. So there's there's the capacity. Then I'll just review. There's two things that I said: the capacity to make commitments and follow through on them, and the capacity to take responsibility, and to be in a kind of conversational game, a conversational practice of taking responsibility and um, offering responsibility. And often, by the way, that doesn't happen just in our mind where we're making a judgment that somebody has failed their responsibility to us. We mostly feel that, first of all, in our emotions. When we get pissed off at somebody, that's a way of holding them responsible for what they've done to us. It's not just a judgment that we make intellectually. Now, look, actually, from talking to some other people I met recently, I was talking to Long O Yang yesterday, who I met through Alton a couple of weeks ago, who's a researcher at OpenAI, and he was really helping. He took me to task a bit with some of the assumptions that were in this paper I wrote with Peter Denning, and I'm trying to do justice to what I learned from him in our conversation the other day, where he said, look, in some minimal sense, the LLMs are trying to do something. They are not just, you're wrong, he was telling me. You and Peter are wrong to say that they are just predictive algorithms predicting the next token. That's not the full picture, because in a certain sense, they have been trained with the human feedback, and they are trying, in a certain minimal sense, they want to produce an interaction that's satisfying with the user. And I found that very thought-provoking and I see that some of the polemics that we have on our essay don't acknowledge that enough that I now think it should. Now, I'm still committed to saying that they're trying or wanting to produce a certain interaction with the user. I'm putting that in scare quotes because it's not maybe it's on a continuum with what human beings do when we try and we want to do things. But I think it's of a different order altogether, that we only metaphorically can apply trying and wanting to what they're doing. But in a certain sense, they're pursuing a purpose, and they're not
Yes.
just strings of words.
So I'm going to stop you there. One of the examples that when we were talking earlier, you brought up was a thermostat.
Yes,
And
yes.
right. And so if we're talking about this objection that was brought up the other day, um, we're forced to compare this wanting of reinforcement learning with human feedback to the cybernetic system of a thermostat, and ask the question, to what degree does the thermostat engage in a commitment? Or
Exactly.
yeah. So where do you land on that? And where do you think there's any merit to the sense that a giant inscrutable matrix is somehow crosses a threshold somewhere from a thermostat, which I think because we can picture all the parts, we can say this is not something with any commitments in any
Hmm.
meaningful sense, versus a large language model?
Yes. Well, look, my hard ass official position is that the large language model is more like a thermostat than we want to admit normally, and that human beings do have a tendency that psychologists call over attribution. We want to attribute human-like qualities to the devices we interact with, and that's on us. It's our readiness, our eagerness to interact with things as agents, on moral agents that are like us, where we have a readiness and a tendency to do that. It's built into the kind of creatures that we are. Um, but there was a big freak out in some of the blogs that I follow last week when Sam Altman said something about wanting to turn the AI, the large language model, into a kind of agent. And that he was suggesting that it's possible that people give control of their computer and their keyboard over to the agent. And that raised a very interesting issue that came up in our conversation that we had about this earlier, because I was arguing that the models, the machines, don't have a way to fulfill commitments. And when we make a commitment, implicit in that is an expectation, a normative expectation that we have of other people that they're going to get out in the world and act in such a way so as to bring about that what they've committed to. And we were saying the LLMs can mimic commitments, but really, that's a proxy. It's like if LLM makes a promise, it's standing in as a proxy for the organization for whom it's a representative. There was this case that came out also in the blog. I was following Gary Marcus's blog. He writes very humorously and bitingly about all these cases. He's a real sleuth to deflate the hype around some of this stuff. That there was a I don't know, I might be butchering the details, but an airline in Canada had a chatbot that made a promise to a user that it could buy a bereavement fare and get fully reimbursed within 90 days. But it made that up, the so-called hallucination or confabulation. And so that was a promise that was made. And it's not the LLM that the user was holding responsible. He's holding responsible the organization. And it was the organization behind the LLM that had to pay up.
Now, in that particular legal case, the argument that was made by the lawyers for Air Canada, I believe it was that Air Canada was not responsible for promises made by other organizations. And in this case, it attributed some degree of agency either to the chatbot or to the company that sold them the chatbot.
Yeah.
So that's
Very,
interesting too.
yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it's very fascinating how the issues of how we attribute responsibility are really starting to bubble up now in our practices of what we're willing to accept as legible or legitimate attributions of responsibility are really being problematized. And I think the judge rightly rejected that claim
Correct.
by the Air Canada.
Yes, that's absolutely right. But let's consider a few other because we run into the danger of speaking about legal conventions rather than the fundamental philosophy that we're trying to talk about here. Because let's say that I'm an employee of an organization, I represent that organization, and I may make a mistake on the job, and I may not be held legally responsible, and the organization may be in my stead, which would put me in exactly the same position as the chatbot from a legal standpoint. So what's the difference there?
I like your point. I mean, that's provocative that we shouldn't collapse legal our intuitions around legal responsibility with our intuitions around everyday responsibility. They don't always coincide. I take your point. Um, and I'm coming back to our invocation of the thermostat and say that the thermostat seems to be responding to um, a situation, and it looks like it's making a decision to turn on the heat or turn on the AC. um, we don't hold the thermostat responsible when it fails. We either say, well, the damn thing is too old and it needs to be replaced, or we hold the repairman or the company responsible. I get that I've wiggled out of your remark somehow by saying our practices of everyday responsibility still bypass the devices and look at the devices as proxies for the human beings that are behind them, their designers and their purveyors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. The thermostat is a useful example because it does. It's a cybernetic device. It does take input from the environment, but at the same time, it's also very clear that it is a proxy for not only the organization that produced it, but also the creator of it, that its behavior is represented by a creator or creators who specifically intended are fulfilling their own intention through the device. Now, what gets weird about large language models and the potential architectures that may be coming in the future that are agentic is that their set of intentions become abstracted away from from the human agents that created them in a very
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
um, confounding way compared to a thermostat, because
Right.
you no longer, yeah, you're no longer talking about, um, yeah, about, just controlling the temperature environment, which is someone has thought through. You're not even talking about a classical computer program,
Yeah.
which is doing something similar, just more complex. With these systems, they may be generating their own goals in a sense,
Yeah.
that are many degrees abstracted away from what their creators intended.
Totally. No, that's a really useful distinction. I mean, the invocation of the thermostat really runs up against a wall in that case, and it no longer is convincing because it does look like we're dealing with a machine and a quasi intelligence on a whole other order. Um, Especially when you start to reckon with the possibility that the model, the machine, I don't know, Long kept referring to them as the model. But in our paper we call them the machines, so I'm flipping back and forth between how I'm
Okay.
to them. Um, Especially when you reckon with the possibility that the model can start to formulate its own goals. Um, you can imagine an agent or a model that observes how you work on your computer all day, and then it suggests things to you that it could automate for you, that it could take care of for you,
Mhm.
and could start to set goals for you. And that is very different from the way that a thermostat works, obviously. But here I would make, I think, a very important further distinction, which is that it's one thing to say that the model can set approximate goal. Um, and the and now I want to say that the reason those goals matter is parasitic upon or derivative of the goals of the human beings that it is seeking to serve. And
Hmm.
I don't see any way, and uh, maybe I shouldn't get in the business of making predictions, but let me do one anyway just for fun. I don't see any way that the machines or models could formulate goals that matter to them, and specifically that matter to them for their own sake, because that's what's consistent or that's what's characteristic of human beings who have stuff that matters to them. We care about certain things for its own sake, not just because they're instrumental towards some other project of ours. We love our partners because we love them, not because they get us status or because they get us money. If you're, at least if you're in the tradition of romantic love, that it's come to be, I guess, romanticized in the West in the past couple of hundred years. Um, Love is supposed to be something that matters to you for its own sake, that makes your life worth living. We have other projects in our life that make our lives worth living that we would not put a price on, that we would not sell, that we would not um, surrender for for some other purpose, because those are the things, those kind of concerns, those kind of sources of meaning or mattering are ultimately has a source of ultimate importance for us that is inaccessible to machines. And this is the source, if you ask me, that the reason why the Nick Bostrom's notion of the perverse instantiation of the paperclip machine. I love his phrase. He says the paperclip machine, I was given a project, a goal, make a bunch of paperclips, and it perversely instantiated this because it has only instrumental rationality. It only sees how to make goals and do them efficiently, goals that have been assigned to it. And that's the problem. That's why these things are we speculate they could be dangerous because they only have instrumental rationality. They don't have a sense in which our instrumental goals are embedded in larger frameworks of mattering about issues that matter to us for their own sake.
Hmm.
Um, anyway, there's a rant for you.
Yeah. No, no, no. It's incredibly relevant. The You have some people like Jan LeCun, who is a computer scientist and one of the three founders of deep learning, is fathers of deep learning, whatever, um, who believe that these issues aren't really issues. Um, his assertion is that when we build machines of this type with agency, we're going to build them in order to fulfill our goals, that will be inherently safe. And he even lays out an architecture for what he believes such a system would need. And in that system, it ends up satisfying, at least superficially, I don't necessarily think fundamentally, some of the qualities that you brought up. specifically in terms of having responsibility. His architecture implements something that I think he calls it the intrinsic motivation module.
Hmm.
The basic idea is a lot like, well, if you're familiar with a generative adversarial network, maybe not, I don't know. Um,
Sure.
that there's a discriminator in there that basically looks at some sort of data that's input that comes from the world, and that causes it to assign some sort of, well, in his paper he gives it basically a real value, and it's either positive or negative. I don't know if he norms it or not, it doesn't really matter. But that effectively determines its self-responsibility and how it behaves in the world, and that intrinsic motivation module would be trained on what makes humans happy, sad, um, in pain, having a good experience, etc. Um, why would something like that fail to satisfy the conditions that you laid out?
Wow, that's very fascinating. Uh, yeah, well, I think that starts to approximate more closely what we're talking about when we talk about human intelligence, because our intelligence is connected to the way things matter to us. It's
Right.
connected to how we're capable of talking about that and articulating it in language. It's connected to the emotions and moods that we experience when we fulfill or fail to fulfill the standards that we set ourselves for living up to our dreams and norms and expectations of each other. And look, here's and so if you were able to kind of siphon off the human sense of mattering and somehow imbue a human sense of mattering into the model, uh, and so it's parasitic upon our sense of what is of ultimate importance. Um, that would be very interesting. But I guess I would say two comments come to me from that perspective. One, human beings are not very good at being clear about what we are and what ultimately matters to us. Actually, it's contested. Essentially, what it means to be human is to be possessed by, to have it matter to you, the question about what matters. There's no one answer for human beings to the question of what matters. To be human is to be gripped by that question. That's a reformulation. That's a reformulation of what Heidegger said about Dasein. He says we're Dasein. Human beings are Dasein. And Dasein is that entity for whom its own being is an issue for it. And it's contested. So the problem here is for us to be able to come to an agreement about what does matter to us ultimately. I think it's probably pretty safe we could get a couple of fair amount of common ground. It matters that we don't make the earth uninhabitable. Uh,
Yes.
that's a pretty good starting point. And there's probably a range of other things connected with what we could acknowledge to be permanent, almost quasi-universal human concerns that could be maybe
Mhm.
translated into um, a way that we could program the machine. But let me say one other thing that's really important from the perspective, and it connected to the Heideggerian intuition that human beings are the beings whose own existence matter to us, and that we never come up with a final answer to what we are. We exist, and our sense of what we are as human beings um, changes historically over time. And so we never arrive at an ultimate answer of what matters to us as humanity. I mean, humanity is a pretty recent invention of human beings, actually. That there's one universal essence among us all that you could abstract out and call it humanity, that we could all agree upon what it is. Recent invention um, that is very contested still. So let us say that in the realm of what ultimately matters, we never have a clear map. We never have a list of ingredients that we could know finally say what it is, and we have to know that it changes historically over time. Um, hmm. I feel like I'm in a tangle of issues that I want to back out of.
Oh yes, you are very deep in a tangle of issues. Um, I love these issues, by the way, but since we're backing up, I actually wanted to step away from this thread before we get back into it and
Yeah.
ask you how you got interested in the debate about AI in the first place.
Thank you. Thank you. That will bring me back to my aforementioned declaration that I was going to dodge your earlier question about
Perfect.
what would enable us to, or what would satisfy us for saying that the models or the machines are participants in our linguistic community. Um, because the tradition that I'm coming from, which is the one from Hubert Dreyfus, who's I'm got their books here, What Computers Still Can't Do. It was published originally in 1972 under the title What Computers Can't Do. It was reissued 20 years later in 1992 called What Computers Still Can't Do. And in the meantime, Bert and his brother Stuart published this book called Mind Over Machine: The Power of Human Intuition and Expertise in the Age of the Computer. And they argue there that the project of imbuing machines with human-like intelligence is bound to fail, at least under the old uh, paradigm, what we call representational AI, or sometimes derisively and sometimes descriptively good old-fashioned AI, or GoFi. That's a phrase that um, was made up by John Hoagland, another philosopher interested in these issues, who was one of Hubert Dreyfus's early graduate students. John Hoagland also has a one-liner that still encapsulates what I think to be my most fundamental angle and interest in the question about computers and AI. John Hoagland has a phrase that starts off his essay um, on understanding natural language. He said, "The problem with artificial intelligence is that computers don't give a damn." And so my interest in these issues came from my inheritance of this tradition of philosophical reflection, from studying with Bert, Hubert Dreyfus, and then eventually also becoming friends with his brother Stuart, who's now 92 and with whom I have lunch once or twice a month still up in Berkeley. We became really good friends, especially since Bert died back in 2017. Stuart and I became friends and have published actually an updated version of the theory of skill acquisition that the Dreyfus brothers formulated in the early 80s. And that became part of their critique of AI. Because according to their model of expertise, of skill acquisition, we start out by following rules when we're beginners and trying to learn a practice. When you're learning how to play the drums, I'm a drummer. You got to have the rule to hit the hi-hats on this kind of note, and then do the bass drum on the 1 and the 3, and the snare drum on the 2 and the 4. You know the rule, and you got to sit there and force your body to do it. And you got to think about it. But over time, as you learn the skill, the rules drop away, and your embodied intuition takes over. I mean, look, this is a woefully compressed version of their argument, but it belongs to a lot of our common sense that when we're learning something new, at first we have to try and we appeal to the rules. And with enough experience, we can stop having to think about the rules and we drop in to let our body take over and our intuition take over. Um, Now, so they marshaled this theory of skill acquisition also to say to fortify their argument against GoFi or representational AI, that human being experts are not actually following rules anymore.
Mhm.
And so I inherited this interest in AI from that philosophical tradition, and they're arguing, look, you're never going to get human-like intelligence with the GoFi. Now, Bert and Stewart were already from early on very sympathetic to the neural network, or what they used to call connectionist paradigm in
Mhm.
AI. And so the arguments that they make against GoFi, they don't claim to hold in all of their robustness against the neural network form of artificial intelligence. And so I need to put that out there too. But they want to say that rather than thinking about how to make machines like humans, let's think about the way human beings and machines can interact. Think about the way that the computer and the artificial intelligence can be cooperators with us, tools of ours, things that we use in our interaction with the world, not try to replace ourselves, not try to mimic our intelligence, but to create something useful for us. And that actually is the argument made by Fernando Flores and Terry Winograd in their 1986 book, Understanding Computers and Cognition, A New Foundation of Design. So they take the basic Dreyfusian argument and say, and they add to it. They say they take not only the Heideggerian background. Bert uses Heidegger. He uses just as much Kierkegaard and a French philosopher named Maurice Merleau-Ponty in his book about what computers can't do. Kierkegaard's the one that brings the issue of commitment, and that the way that human beings are in the world is not just by means and tasks, but we have a field of relevance because we're committed to some things ultimately. And that's how we have being in the world. Heidegger took this on too when he talked about what he called Dasein's for the sake of which. That for the sake of which we live our lives is um, uh, irreducible for talking about the way we have being in the world, the way we're oriented in the world. In this conversation, Fernando and Terry added two other traditions. They drew on the Heideggerian or hermeneutic tradition. Hermeneutics means the theory and practice of interpretation. That's a tangent we won't go into right now. They added, in addition, the speech acts tradition from Austin and Searle, and they added the autopoetic biological tradition from Humberto Maturana and Francisco Varela. And they argued there that all of those traditions converge on the notion that human beings are not in the world. We're not related to the world by way of representations and information. We have a more primordial contact with the world, a more primordial way of being in the world. And all three of those traditions converge on that point. And then they say, look, then rather than trying to program computers to be like us, they were still criticizing GoFi, the representational AI. Why don't we talk about how this new understanding or this more sensitive understanding of what human beings are, things matter to us. We coordinate our commitments in language, and we are autopoetic systems who inhabit an environmental niche, not just a bunch of objects that we form ideas of in our mind. Why don't we take that understanding about human beings and use that to design as the basis of our design of computer tools? And so that's why they called the subtitle of their book A New Foundation for Design. We should be designing our computers, our artificial intelligence systems with a better, more secure, more sensitive understanding of what human beings are. And look, Terry Winograd helped to formulate something called human computer interaction at Stanford, which is now, I think, still what gets now called the human AI alignment problem. Terry, by the way, was the most important researcher in natural language comprehension, natural language programming in GoFi. He wrote his PhD thesis at MIT in the late 60s. He presented a program called Shrdlu, SHRLDU, which was something he got out of Mad Magazine having to do with some kind of old-fashioned typewriter. You'll have to look it up, but he had the most successful model of being able to use natural language and talking to a computer. And he became convinced that representational AI, that he was one of the leading figures in, was doomed to fail because he started talking to Hubert Dreyfus and John Searle and Fernando Flores. And he left behind his research program in artificial intelligence and then co-founded something called Human Computer Interaction and the Stanford Design School. And this is still relevant for us today. The whole issue about human computer interaction or AI alignment means we need to have a good, adequate understanding of what human beings are, what our concerns are, what our way of being is, in order to even adequately pose the question, how do we align ourselves with AI or with machines? And at a future point, I will go on a rant against the notion of value, but I don't know if this is the occasion for it. So I became interested in all of this through this lineage of teachers and teachers and friends and mentors and who have taught me about it.
All right. That brings up another entire nest of issues. Um, so I am wondering where you sit today, looking at the way that we are currently building technology, in what ways are we, and by we, I mean the entire apparatus of the economy and the people working in the field, satisfying and not satisfying the alignment, but human computer interaction of understanding what human beings are. So that's question one. Since you often give big paragraphs of like a million ideas, I'll ask a million questions too.
Cool.
Um, so there's that question. There's another question of to what degree is what a human being is knowable, um, and what implications does that have for the success or failure of an alignment project? Um, and then the other topic I want to go into is you hedged beautifully about the books, what computers can't do and what computers still can't do. And I want to push on that a little bit and say, for the question of what computers still can't do, where we
Nice.
examine deep learning and its implications, what do you see as the limitations of those approaches?
Beautiful. I have an unscripted um podcast moment where I have to let my cat out of my office.
Okay,
All right.
what's your cat's name, by the way?
Paloma.
Nice.
Now, I am afraid to start talking about any one of those issues because it's going to be hard to stop.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
so, um, then I will do my best to start talking about the first one and break in and see if there's a way to um, help push us towards the second two. I actually don't. Let me try to get the third one out of the way. I don't feel confident or qualified to say much about this, except uh, that I will appeal to some of the researchers whose work that I follow and thinking about still even the limitation of neural nets and this alternative paradigm of AI. And so the researchers I always find illuminating and thinking about this look also because they share my prejudices about the big philosophical picture. And so I recognize there's other voices in this conversation, but I find Melanie Mitchell to be very worthwhile to read on these issues. She has a fantastic Substack, a fantastic book called Artificial Intelligence, A Guide for Thinking Humans. And her chapters late in that book say a lot of valuable things about this issue, and that are connected with a very interesting insight and important insight she has that the what we perceive as limitations of human beings, the fact that we operate with um, taken for granted prejudices. And here we have to look at the word prejudice in its etymological root. It's prejudice, prejudgment. Our prejudices are not just the pernicious social attitudes we have about social hierarchies like racism and sexism. Prejudices or prejudgments, in the general sense of the term, are those kind of pre-assumptions, assumptions that we take for granted, that we don't even know we're taking for granted. They form a background against which we make sense of the world. And it looks like a limitation because we're not aware of them. We cannot list all of them. When Doug Lenat and his psych project tried to figure out what common sense knowledge was, and apparently they came up with 25 million facts that we take for granted as common sense knowledge. Our common sense knowledge is not a bunch of facts. It's a know-how. It's not a know that. It's a know-how. It's an embodied know-how. And normally we don't even see that we have it until we get in situations that where our common sense doesn't mesh with the environment that so that we have a jarring reaction. My my example of this is cheesy, but I'm from Florida. I spent my whole life trying not to be Florida man. But one of the things about Florida men is that they have this kind of possessiveness of their space. And they have a underlying or outward aggression, like I'm going to take up space and don't get in my way. And as a socialized man, I was socialized as a Florida man. And when I go to more crowded cities, Florida's got a lot of space, so we're going to take up our space. You go to more crowded cities, um, a beautiful place like Italy, and you're walking around in a crowded city like the little town of Lucca. I like to visit with my partner Alicia, and there's tons of people flying through, coming right at you. And you're, as Florida man, you're bracing yourself to shoulder check some little Italian dude, but suddenly, right when he gets up to you, he flows right by in a beautiful dance. Like their way of being embodied in public space is a dance of near brushes. And it's very beautiful once I was able to shut my Florida man prejudices up and watch and listen and let myself attune to how people were dancing and moving and negotiating their bodies in public. So that's an example of how our background, we don't know we're operating with a background of prejudices and assumptions and embodied know-how until it jars us, until we get into a situation where it doesn't fit.
Hmm.
And that's not just a limitation. I mean, we're the finitude of human being is enabling. It's not disabling. And the fact that we have bodies is part of that. Bodies that grow and die, that have strengths and weaknesses, that have sickness and health. Um, this is very connected to uh, why the kind of intelligence that we have. And so, anyway, I'm kind of hand waving at some of the things that are relevant for human intelligence and human skill that Melanie Mitchell talks about in those later chapters in her book.
Sure. So I want to push back a little. When you talk about the specific prejudices or biases of the human experience that create our set of values or preferences, way of being in the world, and how we make commitments, how we uh, choose one thing over another, um, what is the value of hypothetical beings that have different biases or prejudices? Like, so we may be talking about other biological beings from another species or another planet, or we might be talking about a hypothetical sentience that's built on a very different architecture, like silicon or quantum processing units or whatever. Um, how do we, under your framework, value that set of prejudices?
Mm-hmm. I don't know. But my instinct would be to say something like probably in the same way that we have to confront the different horizons of interpretation out of which other human beings live. And when it comes down to it, that brings us to what we were talking about earlier, like the over attribution tendency that human beings have to attribute intelligence and emotions and skill to machines where it might just be an illusion of that. But in the fairy tale version that autonomous robots start to populate our world and we interact with them, in a certain sense, they will start to be more fully members of our conversation community, our moral community, when we can start to be offended by them. When we start to have to ask ourselves, we have to ask ourselves, why is the machine treating me this way? Um, but I don't know how useful it is for me to speculate further down that road, except to
Well,
say that, yeah.
yeah, I guess a more immediate and non-hypothetical example is, to what degree, if any, like, are we making like, so the only examples that we really have are pseudo users of language in certain animals, where I would argue that they're not really using language the way that we do.
Hmm.
Um, Um, there are examples of like, let's say African greys or other parrots where they do seem to be, at the very least, capable of making a coherent request. Um, for example, my mother has an anecdote about a parrot she grew that was belonged to a neighbor that would scream Dr. Pepper whenever it saw Dr. Pepper because it loved Dr. Pepper. And so there's an implicit request.
Hmm. Hmm.
um, there may not be any commitment there, but at least
Hmm.
there's a request being made. Um, and how do we like relate this framework to how we relate to animals,
Hmm.
for example?
Yes, I think that I feel the traction and the pull of that question. Um, uh, because we do want to grant, or anyway, I want to grant moral standing to animals,
Mm-hmm.
even though they are not linguistic agents in the way that human beings are. And that and so you can um, it's tempting to extrapolate from that and to say that we have a tendency, a readiness to treat animals in a human or a humane like way, or grant them moral standing, want them to take care of their well-being. At least I think we should be doing that. I believe that factory farming is an immense evil perpetrated by human beings against pigs and cows and chickens. It's unfathomable what we do without even thinking about it to these creatures. And you want to, then it's tempting to extrapolate from that and say, well, why can't we grant, why can't we have the same readiness to interact with artificial agents in in a similar way? At least I think that's the direction that you're pointing, is it?
Well, it is, but it does bring up a few points. For example, I saw an interview recently with Lex Friedman and Demis Hassabis from DeepMind,
Hmm.
and Demis brought up a point that he's brought up several other times before. I think when he was arguing with Daniel Dennett about how we navigate the other minds problem, he says that one of the underappreciated um, aspects of our resolution of the other minds problem is that fundamentally we're made of the same stuff.
Hmm.
So it's not merely that we're making commit using language with each other and behaviorally satisfying the external third person appearance of
Hmm.
commitments, but that we can extrapolate from the fact that we're also made of mushy brain goo that have bodies and all of that
Hmm.
you have an experience like I do,
Hmm.
and that with we can take that a step further and say animals are basically made of the same stuff we are. So
Hmm.
when we see their behavior, even though there is not language there, we do see behavior, and we also know they're made of the same stuff we are.
Hmm.
But then when you get to a computer system or any of the machines we build, so far they are not made of the same stuff.
Hmm.
So you don't get that aspect of this first person problem resolution.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Merleau-Ponty has a phrase that's beautiful here. In philosophy, people were talking for a long time about intersubjectivity, which is another way to talk about the problem of other minds. If I'm a subject of experience, and you're a subject of experience, and then so our interaction is supposed to be a phenomenon of intersubjectivity. And Merleau-Ponty, following Heidegger, says subjectivity is a late abstraction. Before we're subjects, thinking subjects, representing subjects, we're skillful bodies in the world. And rather than talking about intersubjectivity, we should talk about intercorporeality. Because in fact, the way I relate to the world is through the embodied skills that I have. And the way I relate to you isn't just as a mind, but it is as another body. And my body is tuned into the posture and readiness of your body. And look, other animals have that too. My cat has intercorporeality with me. She knows that that my face is my face that corresponds to her face because she wants to rub her face on my face. That's a phenomenon of intercorporeality. She's not making a projection in her mind. It's a body to body direct connection. And I think that's fundamental for the way human beings relate to the world and relate to each other and relate to other flesh and blood animals. And for we need to be able to take that seriously in how we design our relationship to design and imagine our relationship to machines. And I suppose that's just a way of underlining and agreeing with the general spirit of your comments. And I want to add then to back up and to take a twist, jumping from there to the first question that you posed, or at least the spirit of your first question, um, which in any way solicited me to say something about the big picture concerns about the historical times that we're living in and the place of artificial intelligence research in this bigger picture. Um, because uh, the the conviction or the prejudice underlying what I took to be a lot of the highfalutin, exaggerated claims about the capacities of large language models to have entered into language and to cracked what it is to be in language like human beings makes the assumption, like I was saying earlier, that language is essentially a transfer of information. It's a string of words that transfers information. And that we relate to the world, we relate to other people as repositories of information. And communication consists in getting my information from my head out through my mouth or through my fingertips into your head. So, and you decode the information. I think this is, in fact, a very problematic and destructive part of a destructive and pernicious big picture of how we understand ourselves and our relationship to the world. Because it inherits a lot of by separating language from emotion and by separating language from mattering and by separating language essentially from our embodiment, our intercorporeality, um, it inherits these old dualisms between mind and body, between um, individual and society, between human culture and nature, that were important in when they developed around the time, say, of the scientific revolutions, because coming up with those distinctions helped for getting the natural sciences, the modern natural sciences, on a firmer footing and overcoming the medieval belief in essences and that we had to listen to what the Catholic Church said in order to ask scientific questions. You know, coming up these dualisms that emerged and that were most very forcefully articulated in the philosophical writings of Rene Descartes played an important role historically, but they've come down to us and they still hold us captive.
Hmm.
And they have been further exacerbated or made more troubling because they connect to the modern technological world in which we live and the attitude that we can solve all problems with more technology. And don't worry about it. Don't stop technological progress. We can solve our problems. We can control our way out of the messes that we've got into, like was put into riveting and troubling articulation in the Andresen piece about techno-optimism recently. This is an expression of what I'm calling technological nihilism. Because when we think that we can control the earth and control everything with our rationality and our problem-solving capacities and our technology, then we're no longer recognizing that anything else has a claim on us, that anything matters to us anymore. Everything becomes instrumental to our own increase in power. And we've lost touch with wonder in that sense, or a sense of what is sacred, of beyond our power. And uh, and I think the model or the presumption that language is just information and that that presumption that crowds out the connection of language to emotion and mattering is part of this bigger picture that we don't recognize that things matter beyond our own increases in our own power and our increases in our own capacity. And um, look, this is nihilism. The reason you know that it's nihilism is because nothing matters anymore besides increasing our own power. And look, if you the best cultural representation of nihilism is still the Coen brothers' 1998 movie, The Big Lebowski. It's
Mhm.
kind of on the nose. They do have characters called the Nihilists. And in the movie, the Nihilists have funny one-liners like, "We care about nothing, Lebowski." And really, all they want to do is engage in petty crime and drink whiskey and float around in a swimming pool. Their nihilism is a weak, very boring nihilism of petty crime and fleeting everyday pleasures. But it raises the issue, does any character in that movie have a meaningful life? And nobody does. And it takes place in Los Angeles, which stands in for the westernmost drift of Western culture. It hits the Pacific Ocean and turns in on itself and self-destructs. Um, Nihilism is a result of that. The Walter, the dude's friend, who is the former Vietnam vet, is obsessed with rules. One way to deal with nihilism is to think that there are rules and structures that you have to obey. Another way to deal with nihilism is more like the dude, the Jeffrey Lebowski, the dude in the movie, who basically just goes with the flow. He's looked up to as a kind of Zen master, but he's not. He's just a kind of lazy. He really is a lazy nihilist. At least he's funny, and at least he sometimes cares about what's going on. He's got glimmers that there's more to life than just petty enjoyment and the pursuit of our own power. Though he's not interested in power. He's interested in petty enjoyment, like bowling, and smoking weed. Um, the world does not make available the technological world where everything is within our power does not make available to us meaningful projects. And so part of what it means to live in a world and to carefully, I mean, design with care, computer systems and artificial intelligence systems needs to be placed in this bigger framework of uh, being able to respond to something that matters to us more than the pursuit of our own control and power. I'm incapable of making the point in any further detail.
Okay. So let me ask a question just that may give you an opportunity to restate a few of those points or elaborate on them. Um, I noticed that in the title of Dreyfus's book and in the title of your paper, the verb is can.
Hmm.
So I want to invite the question of ought, of should. What should computers not do?
Hmm. A lot of things.
Yeah.
um, they uh, hmm. Yeah, I mean, I suppose the question really is what ought or should we be doing with computers?
That's
Uh,
also good. Yeah, the
yeah,
flip version. What should we
yeah,
be doing with computers?
yeah.
And how is that different from what we are doing with computers?
Mm, Yeah, that's a good question. Um, the general answer is that we need to beware of the tendency for computers to make things more, the illusion anyway, of them making things more efficient and frictionless. Um, because uh, we've seen in a lot of the subsequent conversations, and I don't need to remind you of a lot of the details, but the what looks like making an algorithm that can efficiently screen out candidates turns out that it screens out women candidates because they train. This is the famous example of Amazon training the algorithm on the successful applications of the people they had hired hitherto, and it turns out that the algorithm screened out things that were characteristically associated with women, um, and uh, and elevated things that were traditionally associated with activities of men. So when we're gripped by imperatives of being efficient and prioritizing efficiency and frictionlessness, um, we get ourselves into trouble. And this is connected with the sense that in a nihilistic time, efficiency becomes the highest value. Um, and we seek to be able to do things more powerfully, more efficiently, and lose the grip on the question of like what does matter to us for its own sake. And now we are living in times, I get back on my soapbox a little bit. We're living in a time very unique in the history of human beings where the younger generations, especially, and not only them, are starting to sense that the earth itself has a moral claim on us. That we're for the first time earthlings because we have for the first time recognized that the activities of human beings, whether we like it or not, our drive for more efficiency and productivity has created a disaster in ecological disasters and is in danger of undermining our ecological abode. And now a lot of people are starting to feel emotionally a new connection with being denizens of the earth and being earthlings. My favorite example of this is the emotion of flight shame that originated among people in Sweden. Greta Thunberg's mother, who was an opera singer, is one of the people, and there's some other actors whose names I don't recall. But Greta Thunberg herself became an outspoken voice for flight shame. This is a new emotion that whereby we feel shame at being able to just jet set around the world just because it's easy and fun, because we're damaging the earth and it deserves our love and our care. So we ought to be ashamed and ashamed of ourselves in front of other people and in front of the earth for the readiness with which we just pollute because it's easy and we can. And so um, that comes back to the general answer that we need to be careful about always looking for the most efficient, quick, productive, controlling way to be, and and attune ourselves to those conversations, those sense of things that matter to us for their own sake beyond efficiency and productivity. In my case, that means making music and having a community of people to make music with, uh,
So
and um, and so forth. Let me give you a chance
that's
to talk.
yeah, no, I was actually that's a great transition to because we're getting near the end of our time, and there are a few cool, I think cool biographical details about yourself that you haven't touched on yet. One of them is your upbringing, another is your music. Would you mind telling us a little bit about you and how that influences you
Thanks,
now?
Andrew. Yes, and I'm aware at my midlife age of now creating narratives to make sense of of my life heretofore. And recently has been striking me um, to notice that certain characteristics of my upbringing predisposed me to be concerned with these issues that we're talking about. And there's two of them, really three of them now interrelated. The first is that my parents were Hare Krishnas when I was growing up, and my name is B because it's an abbreviation from my devotee name. They call it a devotee name, which was Vamana Bhava. B is an abbreviation for Bhava. It's two words, Vamana and Bhava. And secondly, that I have a lifelong connection to the punk rock music scene. I'm going to be 46 years old and on March 15th, and I started playing drums when I was 14. I've been playing drums in punk bands constantly the whole time ever since. And I realized that actually I wouldn't have been so attracted to being a punk drummer if I hadn't been raised in a Hare Krishna child context. And both of those issues fed into my interest in philosophy and my receptivity or openness to asking questions about why are things as they are? Um, what's going on? Why is the world the way it is? Why are people so weird? So the being raised as a Hare Krishna child was already something that put us in a position of knowing we were not normal, specifically because we were raised vegetarians, and it was the question of eating food, of what food to eat, was is very important. The when you go to school, because lunchtime and breakfast time were social times. It's when you socialize and you have a chance to interact with others. And we always brought our own lunch because we didn't eat the meat that they served in school. So we were aware of ourselves as different. Look, and I have to say, it wasn't just we were aware of ourselves as different. We were aware that everyone else was complicit in the brutal, unthinking murder of animals. It wasn't just that we were Hare Krishna children. The Hare Krishnas, and in our family, they weren't even all Hare Krishnas. My aunt was a vegetarian, not a Hare Krishna. My grandma was a vegetarian, not a Hare Krishna. Um, we were raised in an awareness of the cruelty of factory farming and the killing animals for food when you didn't have to. So we already had a sense of like, why is everyone eating meat without thinking about it? We were aware of ourselves as different and on a different moral perspective. There's class issues going on there too, because we were really poor. Our parents owned my mom and my stepdad owned an ice cream shop that apparently made no money because we didn't have any. And that made us conducive, my brother and I, to the subcultures of skateboarding and punk rock. Because punk rock is another subculture that looks at the mainstream world and says, why is it so messed up? And people go along with it without questioning it at all. And within our little community, I don't want to glorify punk rock because it has a lot of problems too. And in a certain sense, I'm on the other side of it now as I'm an old guy in the punk scene. I'm a scene elder because I'm still around, I'm still at it, and I have a more encompassing perspective that I know it's not all this glorified version of it that I'm about to give you. But the punks, no one needed to tell the punks that the world is messed up and that we live in a world that makes having meaningful projects and meaningful relationships very difficult because American culture prioritized making money, self-assertion, climbing over other people, and the punks um, was a place to point out how messed up that was an awareness of how brutal American foreign policy was. When you grow up listening to the Dead Kennedys and you hear Jello Biafra singing about a holiday in Cambodia, and you're like, what is even going on in Cambodia? And as a little kid, you start to look up and you start to see the big, brutal geopolitical power games. So the punks had a sense of the nihilism of the world, and we made our little bubble where we could weather the storm of a nihilistic, brutal world by creating music with our friends and for our friends and our little music scene, as we call it. Um, I now think that punk is like academia is a kind of artificial bubble. And in a certain sense, it's ruled by a tendency for resignation against engaging with the big problems of the world. There's no way we can deal with this, so we're just going to ignore, screw the world, make our little bubble, and we'll hang out here. Academia does the same thing, actually. We're going to
Hmm.
hunker down, read our books, have our community of scholars, because the world at large is hopeless, and the most we can do is think about it and weather the storm. There's a strong tendency of resignation, resentment, and righteousness in all of those little subcultures. And in my older age, as I reflect upon what calls me the kind of person um, who I want to be, who I aspire to be, is not just to be comfortable in those little bubbles, but to find a way to belong to the world and to love the world despite its nihilism, despite its seeming hopelessness, and to belong to a wave of conversations and relationships that can prepare a better stage for the people who are going to come after us.
We are at time for this podcast. I really want to thank you for being here today, B. Um, I always enjoy talking with you. I learned some new things, even though we've talked about many of these issues before. So I feel really good about this conversation. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Andrew and Alton. Thanks for giving me the chance to go on very interesting conversational adventure with you, and then every now and then to let me go on my ranting monologues and explorations of what it means to be human and challenging nihilistic technological times.
I like your monologues.
Yeah, thanks, B. I really got this texture of how you would orient towards the world and the ways that your mind would generate meaning from that. And it's fun to like ride along with that.
Thanks, Alton. Can I say that the company I work for is called Pluralistic Networks. We have a website that's kind of minimal, but you can sign up to get updates for what me and Fernando Flores are doing. And I have an aspiration to be more on YouTube and Instagram and TikTok. And my handle there is bs.rousse, Rousse. there's not much there yet. This is aspirational, but making public declarations like this is one way we can co-create a future. So be it.
If I Google es.rousse and then plural networks.
Pluralistic networks.
Okay, we will put links to both of those in the video description so that our viewers do not have to try those things and can just get to them right away.
Excellent.
That'll be available. Well, I'll just say 24 hours after this gets released. We'll make sure that happens. All right. Thank you, everyone who is listening and has listened. This is Andrew, Alton, and B from the AI Safety Salon.